The street, in most retellings, is remembered for how normal it seemed before it stopped being normal. Not a dramatic place, not a back alley soaked in neon, just the kind of city block where the light from shop windows spills onto the pavement in uneven rectangles, where a car passes every few minutes, where someone's radio leaks through a half-open window, and then disappears at the corner. It is evening. The air has cooled slightly from the day. The temperature sits in that range where people keep their jackets open, not because they need them, but because they like the weight of them. On the sidewalk there is movement without urgency, two men walking in step, a couple pausing near a doorway, someone finishing a cigarette and letting the ember die before flicking it into the gutter. Bruce Lee steps out into that atmosphere without drawing attention to himself. Witnesses who describe his presence in public spaces often describe the same contradiction. He is not tall, not physically imposing in the way strangers imagine when they hear his name, and yet he has an uncommon way of occupying a few feet of ground. Not with intimidation, with alignment, with the sense that he has already measured the space and doesn't need to keep proving it by looking. He does not scan faces dramatically. He does not look for trouble. He moves with the unhurried discipline of someone who has trained his nervous system not to jump at shadows. A lot of the details around this story are told differently depending on who repeats it. Some place it outside a restaurant. Some place it near a training hall. Some describe a brief stop to speak to someone he knew, a small exchange that meant nothing at the time, and only becomes a setup later in memory. That is how these incidents often survive, not through a single definitive record, but through fragments that stay consistent in tone even when the location blurs. What does remain consistent is that the night does not feel dangerous at first. If there are people nearby, they are not an audience in the theatrical sense. They are background, ordinary city life. A few pedestrians, a couple of men lingering near a storefront, someone waiting for a ride. Nothing that announces itself as a scene. The first shift, the one witnesses remember most clearly, is not a sound. It is a change in spacing. In the retellings, Bruce is walking or standing near the edge of the sidewalk when three men enter the same piece of space. They don't run in. They don't shout. They approach the way men approach when they want the encounter to look like it wasn't their idea. Casual pace. Shoulders loose. Voice is low. 3 is a specific number in street stories because it creates geometry. One can talk. One can drift to the side. One can stay just behind, close enough to make the other person feel the edges of a corridor forming around him. They don't need to touch him to change what the sidewalk feels like. They don't need to display anything to suggest threat. The implication, as it's told, comes from hands. One man keeps a hand low and close to his coat seam or waistband area. Another stands close enough that stepping back would require giving ground in front of witnesses. The third watches the environment, not staring, but checking. It is not an overt ambush. It is a slow closing. And Bruce, in the accounts that repeat, does not speed up. He does not square his shoulders like a man inviting a fight. He simply stops moving forward, as if accepting that the next few seconds will be decided by what the space allows. The street continues to be a street. Cars pass. Light hums. People pretend not to notice. But the air between those four bodies becomes strangely private. They didn't rush him. That is one of the details that makes the story feel believable to the people who repeat it. Real intimidation, especially in public, rarely begins with speed. It begins with control. Control of distance, of exits, of what the bystanders will later say they saw. The three men spoke softly. Not friendly, not openly hostile. Soft in the way that forces the other person to come closer, to lean in, to enter their frame. A raised voice draws attention too quickly. A low voice draws attention slowly, and slow attention is easier to shape. Witnesses describe the first words as ordinary on the surface, something that could be interpreted later as a misunderstanding. A question, a comment, a remark about who he was, spoken as if they already had the right to speak to him like that. And then the pressure arrives in the subtext. Not a clear threat, an implication. One man stays just a half step behind the speaker, close enough that the speaker feels supported without needing to turn his head. The third drifts, slightly to the side, not far enough to look like a flanker, just far enough that Bruce's easy path forward is no longer easy. A sidewalk becomes a narrow channel when three bodies decide it should. The hand is what people remember. Not a knife being waved, not a blade catching light. The hand that stays low, near a coat seam, near a waistband, near the place where a weapon could exist without being shown. It's a common posture among men who want the other person to believe something is present. It doesn't even require a weapon to work. It only requires the suggestion of one. In the versions that are told with restraint, nobody says, "I have a knife." They don't need to. The hand says it for them. The point is to make the other man calculate risk, to make him hesitate, to make him negotiate. Negotiation is the first concession. Once you begin negotiating, you are already reacting. Bruce Lee, as the story is told, doesn't negotiate. He doesn't lecture them. He doesn't try to charm them. He doesn't perform confidence to prove he has it. He simply stays where he is, balanced, as if he's waiting for them to decide whether they want to keep moving forward or stop. That stillness changes the temperature, because men who build pressure usually expect one of two responses: fear or anger. Fear gives them control. Anger gives them a reason to escalate and claim, "The other man started it." Stillness gives them neither. So the speaker tries to tighten the situation with words that are designed to create a public trap. Words that suggest that walking away would be disrespect, that standing still is refusing, that any choice Bruce makes can be interpreted as weakness if the story is told the right way afterward. This is where the setting matters. If there are bystanders, if there's even one person within earshot, the trap becomes stronger, because the threat is no longer only physical, it becomes social. The men want a moment that can be retold with them as the ones in control. But the street doesn't behave like a stage. It's too ordinary, the light too flat, the noise too constant. And Bruce's calm, his refusal to decorate the moment, keeps it from becoming the kind of confrontation that feeds ego. Witnesses often describe him making a tiny adjustment here. Not a fighting stance, not a guard, just a shift of weight, a slight turn of the hips, the kind of movement that changes the relationship between his feet and the ground, so that if someone grabs him or rushes him, he won't be upright and compliant. To most people watching, it would look like nothing. To the three men, it reads as readiness without invitation. And readiness without invitation is unsettling, because it forces the next step. Either they back away and lose the moment they came to create, or they cross the boundary and make it real. In the versions that persist, the turning point isn't a shouted threat. It's the moment the exchange stops being only words. Up to that point, everything could still be rewritten afterward. A misunderstanding, a brief argument, men being men on a sidewalk. The kind of thing people shrug off the next day because nothing really happened. But public tests don't stay verbal for long when the room or the street doesn't respond the way the challengers want. Witnesses describe the same kind of escalation you see in crowded places, when pride feels cornered. The speaker leans in a fraction, voice still low, and the space tightens again. A half step that isn't an attack, but isn't nothing. The men behind him adjust their positions in small, practiced ways. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just enough to make the sidewalk feel narrower. And then the boundary is crossed. A hand comes up. Not a punch. Not a full tackle. A reach. A touch. A grab at fabric or shoulder line. Something that can still be framed later as just talking, even as it changes everything in the body. That first contact is what makes bystanders look up, even if they pretend they didn't. It changes the status of the moment. Once someone puts hands on someone, it stops being a story you can safely ignore. It becomes a record that lives in the nervous system. People remember where they were standing. They remember whether they moved. They remember what they didn't do. Bruce Lee, in the accounts that repeat, does not step backward. He does not throw his hands up in a theatrical guard. He does not respond with visible anger, which would have given the three men what they needed: a clear emotional frame, a reason to escalate, a way to tell the story later, as if they were reacting rather than initiating. Instead, witnesses say, he moves like someone handling a practical problem. A small shift, more angle than distance, a change in where his weight sits, the kind of movement that doesn't look like fighting until you realize the other man's leverage is gone. The man who reached in, the one who made it physical, is remembered as losing certainty first. Not collapsing, not flying backward, just reorganizing shoulders, dipping, feet adjusting quickly, as if his body is trying to recover from a decision it didn't get to finish. That's the detail people argue about afterward, because it happens fast enough that different eyes report different mechanics. One person insists it was a twist. Another insists it was a step that made the grab meaningless. Another remembers only that the hand that had been ready was no longer in the same position. What stays consistent is the sound. Not a big impact, not a crash. A small scuff of shoes, a sharp inhale from someone watching, the brief hush that follows a sudden change. And then the street or the space around them goes quiet in a specific way. Not fear, attention, the kind that makes people stop pretending they aren't watching. The other two men tighten slightly, as if recalculating. This is where the story becomes heavier, because groups rely on momentum. They arrive with a plan, pressure, formation, implied threat. But when the first contact produces a result that doesn't match the plan, the next move costs more. It becomes psychological, and psychological moments feel longer than they are. The speaker tries to recover the narrative, something about rules, about respect, about not being afraid, words meant to pull the moment back into his control. But the words land differently now, because everyone has seen the same thing, even if they can't describe it cleanly. The first boundary crossing didn't make Bruce Lee smaller. It made the men who crossed it hesitate. And hesitation, in a public test, is the beginning of the end. After the first contact, the street doesn't erupt. It narrows. That's what witnesses describe an invisible tightening, as if the ordinary noise of the block is still there, but slightly farther away. A car passes, tires whispering over the road. Somewhere a door closes. But the space around the four men becomes its own small room, defined by posture and distance. The three men did not come for a scuffle that looked even. They came for a verdict. And now the verdict is beginning to lean away from them. The lead man, the one who had been speaking most, tries to restore control by doing what public testers often do when a first move doesn't land. He increases pressure while pretending he isn't. He steps closer, just enough that the sidewalk feels tighter again. His voice stays low. He says something that can be remembered later as reasonable, but is meant to corner Bruce into reacting. Something about respect, something about real, something about whether he's going to do it or not. The point isn't the sentence. The point is to force a visible response. And he's still trying to do it without committing fully, because full commitment carries risk. Full commitment is how you end up being the man everyone watches lose. So he does what ego often does, when it can't accept either clean option, stepping back or stepping in honestly. He reaches again, but in a way that can be explained away. A hand lifting toward the shoulder line, a touch that could be called checking distance, a grab that could be dismissed later as just testing. This is how men try to keep one foot in safety and one foot in dominance at the same time. The street sees the intent anyway. That's another detail that repeats. The bystanders might not know the technique, might not know the theory, but they understand the moment a man decides to put hands on another man again. The hand reaches in, and Bruce Lee moves. Witnesses do not describe it as a fight beginning. They describe it as a problem being removed. The movement is small, a shift of angle, a subtle relocation of his own body so that the other man's hand no longer has the leverage it expected. It looks, to untrained eyes, like a simple step and a turn, but it has an immediate effect. The lead man's posture changes instantly, shoulders dipping, weight breaking, a half step he did not plan. Not a spectacular fall, not a dramatic crash, just a loss of structure, the kind you can feel in your own bones when your body suddenly stops cooperating with your intention. That is the moment the story's title keeps coming back to. The hands drop, not because someone delivered a theatrical warning, because the moment makes the next move feel expensive. In these retellings, the men don't argue about whether Bruce won. They argue about what they saw in the challenger's face. The brief confusion, the sudden caution, the look that says, that didn't work the way it was supposed to. The second man in the group, standing close enough to support the leader's presence, shifts his feet slightly. He doesn't rush forward. He doesn't escalate. He reads the change and recalculates. The third man, who had been the quiet one, glances down for a moment, as if checking what his own hands are doing. This is the turning point, because groups depend on shared confidence. When shared confidence cracks, the formation becomes fragile. Each man starts thinking about his own outcome instead of the group's performance. The lead man speaks again, quieter now. The words are meant to save face, to create a door out of the moment without admitting retreat. He tries to frame it as nothing, as just talking, as no problem, but the body language tells the truth. The shoulders are slightly turned inward now. The hands that were ready are no longer forward. The feet no longer point straight at Bruce. They angle towards space, toward exit, toward the possibility of leaving. Bruce Lee does not chase. He does not raise his voice to mark victory. He doesn't punish their hesitation by escalating it into violence. The restraint is part of what makes witnesses remember the incident as control rather than aggression. He simply stands balanced, as if the next step is not his to take. And in the space of a few seconds, in the way stories compress time when the outcome is clear, something changes in the men who came to create a moment. They stop trying to create it. Their hands drop, their posture softens, the corridor they built loosens. The sidewalk feels wider again, not because the street changed, but because their intention did. They didn't run. That detail is one of the reasons the story stays believable when it's told carefully. People who get embarrassed in public rarely flee in panic. Panic would confess too much. Most of the time, they retreat the way pride retreats, slowly enough to pretend it was chosen. The lead man said something witnesses don't always agree on the exact words, because words aren't the part that sticks. The tone is remembered more than the sentence. A low voice, almost casual, trying to flatten what just happened into something that could be dismissed. A line that suggests it was nothing. A line that suggests it was just talking. A line that offers a thin bridge back to dignity. His companions followed that cue. Their bodies shifted first, not their faces. A slight turn of shoulders, a small opening in the formation. The corridor they had built around Bruce loosened at the edges. And then, almost at once, the sidewalk felt like a sidewalk again. People who had been holding their breath didn't exhale loudly. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. A city street is not a stadium, and most bystanders understand, instinctively, that noise would turn the whole thing into theater. Instead, the bystanders did what people do when something awkward happens in public. They pretended the moment was smaller than it felt. A man near a storefront looked down at his cigarette as if he'd been studying it the whole time. Another person shifted their weight and stared at a window display. A couple walking past slowed half a step and then remembered they were supposed to keep walking. That's the strange choreography of public restraint. Everyone acts normal, not because the moment was normal, but because acknowledging it would make it real in a way that lasts. The three men moved away in a tight cluster, still trying to look like they were leaving by choice. Their shoulders were slightly turned inward now, as if protecting something that wasn't physical. Their pride. The lead man no longer addressed Bruce directly. In the versions that repeat, he avoided turning back. He spoke to his companions in quick, low phrases meant to control the story they would tell later. Even when people walk away, they keep fighting in their language. Bruce Lee stayed where he was, not planted in the center like a victor, not lingering to be watched, just present, as if he was allowing the street to return to its ordinary shape without needing him to perform an ending. He didn't call after them. He didn't threaten them. He didn't deliver a speech that bystanders could quote. That absence is part of what gives the story its long life. Because when a man talks too much after a moment like that, he turns witnesses into critics. He gives people a target for skepticism, but silence gives them nothing to argue with. In the retellings that feel closest to lived experience, Bruce's movement afterward is small. He shifts his stance slightly, not as a victory pose, but as a return to comfort. He looks where he was going, as if remembering his original direction. He resumes walking or standing in the same calm rhythm the encounter interrupted. A few seconds later, traffic continues. People pass. The light stays the same. The city absorbs the event the way cities absorb everything, by continuing. But something has changed in the people who saw it, because they didn't see a brawl. They saw a moment where a situation was being shaped, three men trying to build a public trap, and the trap didn't hold. They saw pressure meet structure. They saw implied threat meet calm readiness. And most of all, they saw something that is hard to describe afterward without sounding like exaggeration. The outcome arriving early, before the method could be named. That is why the story travels. Not because it contains a cinematic fight, because it contains a quiet reversal. Weeks later, it becomes a small story told in training spaces, in barbershops, in car rides after work. People argue about details the way people always do. Was it one hand or two? Was it a grab or a shove? Was the knife actually there, or was it only implied? That disagreement doesn't kill the story, it keeps it alive. Because the core remains unchanged across versions. Three men closed in. One of them made contact, and the hands that had been ready to lift ended up lowered, not through a loud display, through a shift that made the next step feel too costly. Some people who hear the story interpret it as fear. Fear of Bruce, fear of consequences, fear of embarrassment. But in the better retellings, it isn't framed as fear. It's framed as recognition. Recognition that the man in front of them was not interested in performing, and that performance was the only advantage they had brought. Years later, the story becomes less about the three men and more about what that moment suggested to anyone who has ever been tested in public. That public traps don't require fists to be dangerous. They require witnesses. They require narrative. They require someone to react in a way that can be clipped, repeated, turned into a story that favors the challenger. And if the person being tested refuses to give them that reaction, if he stays balanced and quiet, the trap collapses under its own need for attention. Bruce Lee didn't turn it into a legend with words. He let other people do that part. He simply left the moment the way he entered it, with control that didn't demand applause. And that is why, long after the street returned to normal, the story remained. Not as a tale of violence, as a tale of a few seconds when the city watched something it couldn't easily explain and then went back to pretending nothing happened. The kind of story people repeat because it ends in the most unsettling way possible. Not with a bang, with hands dropping, with silence, with the sense that the method, whatever it was, happened too cleanly to be caught by anyone who wasn't looking for it. And then, like every ordinary night, the street kept moving, but the witnesses carried the stillness with them, forever.